I started looking into the whole Bitcoin phenomena when a friend of mine who was a bit of a kind of a computer geek type of person back in like 2012 mentioned Bitcoin at a dinner. And then I sort of looked into it, and the more I looked into it, the more interesting it became for me, and started solo mining and then pooled mining back in 2013, 2014. And at that time, I was doing a master's degree in economics, and I developed a pricing model for my thesis. And then when I got into my PhD program in sociology, I ended up continuing with that interest and writing a couple things about blockchain Bitcoin from more of a sociological angle. And so what I'm going to present today is kind of a combination of two things that I've been working on. One is the question of whether or not Bitcoin is money, which is sort of this question that keeps coming around and around. I don't want to dwell on it too much. I'll kind of stake out my claim of where I stand in the debate. But then using that, going back and looking at the archival evidence of the sort of discourses that were going on around the knowledge creation, both on the academic side and also on the builder side of the cypherpunk community, sort of how they built it, what they were talking about, and was it ever meant to be money in the first place? And if not, what is it then? And what do we have? What have they left us with? So I'm going to go and share my screen. Okay. So cryptocurrency, is it world money or money worlds, or how Bitcoin was never meant to be money? And so the claim that I'm trying to challenge is that Bitcoin is this world money, or was intended to be this world money, as well as all the other cryptocurrencies that have followed suit. So in some ways, this claim is plausible in the sense that it's an internet-based money or internet-based thing that has no geographic borders because of that. But you know, if it's money, we're not using it as global money, or at least in the last, decade plus, it really hasn't gained adoption as money, and maybe there's a reason for that. So I'm going to stake out the claim where I sit in terms of the money debate, which is a debate, and people might not agree with me, but I approach the meaning of money from the definition of it being first and foremost a unit of account. Okay, so I don't necessarily put primacy with money being a means of exchange or a store of value. Before you have those two things, as far as I'm concerned, as well as several others in the sociological and anthropological tradition of money, is that first and foremost, it is a measure of value. And it's a socially accepted exclusive unit measure of value, meaning that in the United States, for example, dollars is the unit measure of value. In the European Union, it's the euro. In the UK, it's the pound. And just as we have, the metric centimeter and the imperial inch, these are both units of measure of distance. Instead, dollars and British pounds are unit measures of value. And once you have that unit measure of value, then you can start transmitting that value. And then you can start storing up that value as well as pricing things in that value. So I stand by the claim that unit of account is what makes something money in the first place. And just like other types of units, they are socially bounded, sometimes geopolitically bounded by country borders. So we have different countries, different money. In the US, we use inches. In Europe, we use metrics. There's different electricity, voltages and cycles, and also the shape of the electrical sockets. So all of these things can be commensurated and converted, but you need to convert it because when you're in the UK, I'm in Israel now, I cannot use the shekels there. They are no good as money. Likewise, in Israel, they use the metric system. If I tell somebody I weigh 150 pounds, that doesn't mean anything to them. So we need to understand where things are priced in that unit of account. And so we can ask the question, from this perspective, when or where is monopoly money money? So monopoly money, I would argue, is money in the social boundary of an instance of a game of Monopoly. So you have 2, 3, 4 people sitting around the game board, and everything in the game is priced in Monopoly money. So that becomes the unit of account. And then it's transmitted through these papers, these representations of 5, 10, 20, 100 Monopoly dollars. And the transactions take place so that if you land on a certain square, you have to pay rent priced in that unit and so forth. Now, what would happen in the game? You lose the game when you're out of money. If you lose the game and then you take out your pocket and pull out a 20-pound note, your friends that are playing the game with you are going to probably say, no, that's no good in this game, right? So the money is no good in that, your British money is no good in that social boundary of the game. So we can similarly ask, when or where is Bitcoin money? And my argument is that Bitcoin is money only where things are exclusively priced in that unit. And that happens to be in only one place, and that's bounded by the socio-technological boundaries of the Bitcoin blockchain itself. So within that blockchain, you have miners and you have transactions, and the miners are confirming those transactions. The transactions are priced in Bitcoin, and the fees attached to those transactions, the confirmation fees, are priced in Bitcoin. And at the end of the day, the miners are rewarded for doing their confirmation and validation work in Bitcoin. So everything in that universe is priced in Bitcoin. So where is Bitcoin money, based on the definition that I'm using, would be within this space, okay? So I'm going to come back to this point at the end of the talk, but this is where I stand on it. So my arguments, looking backwards then, is in this, taking this definition, Bitcoin was never meant to be money in this sense in the first place. Rather, it stemmed from an engineering solution to technical problems. It was really focused and born out of concerns about online privacy, about snooping by governments and corporations on how we spend our money on the internet, and also this problem of how do we solve double spend? You know, if we have things that are simply digital representations of value, how come, you know, we can't just counterfeit that at will? And so the double spend problem was another technical problem that needed an engineering solution. This was then combined with a specific ideology from the cypherpunks movement, which was all about privacy in society, a more general idea of privacy, a general mistrust of governments and corporations, and a sort of, in the manifesto that they developed, it was to use technology to empower individuals against technology that is being used against them. So to fight technology with technology, which suggests that whatever Bitcoin or the blockchain cryptocurrencies that have come after it today, they're important and they're really interesting, but maybe there's something completely different than money. Disruptive, just the same. And so I'll propose 3 other ways also of looking at this, at what blockchains and what Bitcoin are from sort of an ontological perspective. So let's begin at the beginning. So there's 2 streams of knowledge creation that gave birth to what we know now as Bitcoin when it was launched in 2009. There was an academic side, which was creating engineering solutions to technical problems. And then there was the ideological side on the right, which was dealing with social problems. And I'll deal first with the left column and then the right. A lot of these are familiar for us as academics. They had to do with academic conferences, publishing journal papers, peer review, solutions to problems that were incremental in a sense of like a Kuhnian normal science, incremental progress. And they described technological innovation, but often didn't build it themselves. And if we look at this timeline, we can see that a lot of the precursors that would eventually become Bitcoin goes back at least 30 years before Bitcoin itself was introduced. So we can start with David Chaum. This is David Chaum here. In 1985, at one of these academic conferences, he wrote this kind of passage in his presentation paper, in his conference paper, where he wrote, "The foundation is being laid for a dossier society in which computers could be used to infer individuals' lifestyles, habits, whereabouts, and associations collected from data from data collected from in ordinary consumer transactions. Uncertainty about whether data will remain secure against abuse by those maintaining or tapping it can have a chilling effect. Now, this was very prescient. He wrote this in 1985, before Facebook and before social media became, ubiquitous, and we become used to our every movement and every transaction, every interaction online being commodified as data and sold to marketers and whomever else. So this was done, this was a thought that was on his mind way back in 1985 and probably before 85. And what David Chaum did was he started looking for solutions to this potential problem. One thing that he came up with was the advent of blinded signatures. So a blinded signature is basically, it allows you to sign, the signing party can verify the authenticity of a message without knowing its content and without the having to need the ability to link the signed message to the original. So in cryptocurrency, the use of blinded signatures allows for increased privacy and anonymity by obscuring the link between inputs, outputs, and addresses, making it difficult to trace the flow of funds unless you know somebody's address. So back in 1982, this was proposed, blinded signatures for untraceable payments. So already we're starting to get this idea that if we're going to be spending money on the internet, or whatever the proto-internet was at the time, that we would need some way to protect our identities and keep it private. The next big innovation, also from the crypto conferences, and again with David Chaum contributing, was the idea of how do we get rid of this double spend issue? How do we prevent people from using basically if you have a digital photograph online, it's represented by zeros and ones, you could just copy it at will, forward it to 1,000 people on your by email, and now you've just created 1,000 replicas of exactly the original. So how do we keep that from, for example, banknotes or digital versions of tokens that would represent something like a payment? And the answer was to use zero knowledge proofs. Okay, so ZKPs, or zero knowledge proofs, was the innovation. Again, this came from academic cryptography, from computer science and mathematics departments at universities. So a zero knowledge proof is a method by which one party, the prover, can prove to another party, the verifier, that a statement is true without revealing any additional information beyond the fact that the statement is indeed true. So this is a cute little paper called How to Explain Zero Knowledge Protocols to Your Children. Basically, the idea of a zero knowledge proof is this. Say you have two people, Peggy and Victor, and Peggy has the secret password to this door, and she doesn't want to tell Victor what it is, so he says, I don't believe you. I don't believe you know the password. And she says, I'll prove it to you. So there's this cave that she's able to enter that has the magic door all the way out the opposite side. And there's path A and path B. So Peggy randomly takes either path, A or B, while Victor waits outside, and then Victor chooses an exit path and says, come out of A or come out of B. And then Peggy reliably appears at the exit that Victor names. So you can say, okay, maybe they don't know the password, but they're going in B, and then he calls B and just turning around the way they came. That's a 50% chance. But if you repeat this something like 20 times and you consistently come out the path that's been named, the probability that it's being done by dumb luck or chance is something infinitesimally small. It's like there are more stars in the universe than the chances of that happening. So basically, the idea is that by virtue of this, Victor can be certain that Peggy knows the password without having to know what the password actually is. So this is then used for double spend protection, that you can know that you've sent a specific transaction output that cannot be duplicated because you don't have to know what the transaction is. That's the innovation. We don't have to reveal anything about the nature of the transaction, who is the sender, who is the receiver, just the fact that it was done. So more innovations came throughout the 80s and early 90s, including the ability to subdivide crypto tokens into several pieces, to proactively prevent double spend instead of having to do it retroactively, the ability to store digital tokens in a cryptographic wallet using public-private key pairs. All of this sort of stuff was developed incrementally through the 80s and 90s. So by the early 1990s, we had what could be a workable digital cash system. The difference was that these all would have to rely on something central. So decentralization was not at all a concern from the academic side of the knowledge creation here. It was all about creating these technical solutions, and they all simply assumed, or all of these technological solutions relied indeed on the fact that there would be some centralized mint or bank that would stamp and sign for the blinded signatures, or that would actually do the double spend detection. And indeed, David Chaum founds a startup called DigiCash in 1989 in collaboration with two big banks, Mercantile and Deutsche Bank. And it never really catches on. It sort of flounders around for a dozen years or so before it goes bankrupt. Nowhere are the issues or properties of moneyness mentioned. In the economic sense, they describe means of payment, but the social unit of account is taken as a given. So if this DigiCash was to be used in the US, it would be $1 that was being sent, and it would be a bank that would sign. If it was in Germany at the time, it would have been Deutsche Marks. So it wouldn't have been some sort of new money form, just a new way to send payments. So let's shift now to the ideological side of the cypherpunks. And this was much more about things like property rights. What do we do if the government fails? How do we keep the deeds to our homes? How do we do things peer-to-peer and disintermediate these quote unquote trusted third parties that we really don't trust? How do we get privacy in the digital age? And so the cypherpunks started in the late 80s and mostly into the 90s as this sort of Usenet group on the internet that at one point had up to 700, I believe 700 active users. And Usenet groups like this are great for archival research because they all still exist, because they're all online, all that correspondence and all the posts are still around. So an ideology of privacy was probably the overarching theme in these Usenet posts and the discourses that were going back and forth. And of particular concern was the ability of the state or other powerful actors, such as corporations, especially in times of political instability, to sort of take our property away, to destroy or confiscate our property, our land, and the corresponding property records. And they argue that even in times of political stability, property owners often feel the need or are compelled to purchase things like title insurance or proof of title in order to validate their ownership of property. As Eric Hughes wrote, and Eric Hughes was one of the founding members of the cypherpunks, privacy in an open society requires anonymous transaction systems. Now, one of the first things that this group built was not a payments or transaction system, but was actually email remailers. So anonymous remailers that would take an email that you would want to send without anyone knowing who you were. And basically it would bounce off a series of email servers on different computers and would obscure your true identity. Hal Finney in 1992 writes the following. Hal Finney was another cypherpunk, and he was also the first person to receive a Bitcoin transaction from whoever Satoshi Nakamoto is, which leads some to believe that Hal Finney was indeed Satoshi. Matters, but Hal Finney died several years ago from a disease, so we wouldn't know. But he writes, here we are faced with the problems of a loss of privacy, creeping computerization, massive databases, more centralization, and Chaum. So here's the link now that he's making between the academic work in cryptography, and David Chaum offers a completely different direction to go in, one which puts power into the hands of the individuals rather than governments and corporations. The computer can be used as a tool to liberate and protect people rather than to control them. Unlike the world of today or the early 90s, where people are more or less at the mercy of credit agencies, large corporations, and governments, Chaum's approach balances power between individuals and organizations. So again, we're seeing this idea of using technology for the good of the little guy, and this creeping or this concern about this creeping surveillance, this panopticon of the internet, and especially the use of it by governments and corporations. Nick Szabo, another cypherpunk who's still around today, proposed a solution based on combining the cryptographic methods developed in the 1980s with something new. And he writes in 98, quote, "New advances in replicated database technology that will give us the ability to securely maintain and transfer ownership for a wide variety of kinds of property, including not only land, but chattels, securities, and monetary instruments. This technology will give us public records which can survive a nuclear war. While thugs can still take physical property by force, the continued existence of correct ownership records will remain a thorn in the side of usurping claimants." So this sounds a lot like a blockchain, a public replicated database. This is 1998. Remember, this is 11 years before Bitcoin is introduced. The thing here is that they're also, monetary instruments is but one thing. He's talking about all kinds of property ownership. Land deeds, chattels, securities, etc. And so how do we then get this shared database? How do we remove the trusted third parties? And he goes on to write, a group gets together on the internet, decides to keep track of the ownership of some kind of property. This property is represented by titles, names referring to the property, and the public key corresponding to a private key held by its current owner, signed by the previous owner, along with a chain of previous such titles. The purpose of the replicated database is simply to securely agree on who owns what. The entire database is public. This is a blockchain. This is a description of a blockchain 11 years before we see the implementation of a blockchain in Bitcoin. And not only that, but it uses the public key as the address for the private key held to sign those transactions and so forth. So a lot of the pieces are already developed. The thing also is that we needed to solve, or Chom had also a solution with blinded signatures and with zero knowledge proofs, but we also needed to solve this idea of trust without third parties. So remember, all of these cases before, we had a central authority that was backing the system, that was backing the trust in the system. And the answer is going to be proof of work. And what proof of work does is it solves this Byzantine generals problem. And I don't want to go into the problem in detail. If anyone really wants to look at it, there's tons written on it. But essentially, it's a way to make sure that a message that's sent between a decentralized or distributed network, in the case of blockchains, wouldn't be intercepted and altered, that you can maintain the fidelity of the message, that we know that the message is secure and that was received intact. And this proof of work innovation actually was developed, surprisingly enough, at one of these crypto conferences in the early 90s, but it wasn't meant for cryptocurrency. It was intended to be a junk mail or spam filter. The idea was to have a computer do a little bit of work that maybe takes 1 or 2 or 3 seconds of computer processing time in order to send an email. Now, if you're sending 1 or 2 or even 100 emails in a day, you're not going to notice it. But if you're a spammer sending millions of emails in a day and each email needs 3 seconds of computer time to process, that's 3 million seconds. It's a lot of time. I think that could be years. And the idea was never developed beyond the spam filter. Sort of this idea was never implemented as a spam filter. But what Nick Szabo did was he incorporated this into what he called BitGold, also in 1998 when he was very prolific. And he wrote, precious metals have an unforgeable scarcity due to the costliness of their creation. This once provided money with the value of which was largely independent of any trusted third party. Precious metals have a problem, however. It's too costly to assay them repeatedly for common transactions. Thus, a trusted third party was invoked to stamp a standard amount of metal onto the coin. What's worse is you can't pay online with metal. Thus, it would be very nice if there were a protocol whereby unforgeable costly bits could be created online with minimal dependence on trusted third parties. and then securely stored, transferred, and assayed with similar minimal trust. BitGold. My proposal for BitGold is based on computing a string of bits from a string of challenge bits using functions called proof of work functions. The resulting string of bits is the proof of work. So we now have the entire thing that we need for Bitcoin. And this is also one of the reasons why people think Nick Szabo is maybe Satoshi, although he vehemently denies that he is. But basically BitGold, which was never actually implemented, it was only described, has basically all the pieces of Bitcoin 11 years before it comes to be. So it's also worth noting that others were thinking about the sort of shared database part of the technology, but they never incorporated it plus the proof of work. That was the big innovation. So back in the 90s, you had things like Millicent, NetBill, Micromind, B-Money, and Mojo Nation. Mojo Nation was probably the most similar to what ended up being Bitcoin. It was like a way to accumulate and transfer value in order to download files like from Napster and things like that at the time. This is just the Satoshi version of it now. So if we fast forward to 2008 and look at the kind of correspondences that were going on online, he writes, they use a proof of work chain to solve the problem. We're talking about the Byzantine general's problem. Once each general receives whatever attack time, yada, yada, yada. But basically, he's explaining that he's going to use proof of work to solve this Byzantine general's problem. We can now have a decentralized, trusted system. And of course, we have the Bitcoin white paper, which he calls a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. Now, through all of this development of using these technologies that were created on the one hand for academic purposes, applied to ideological purposes of privacy and control online of your spending and your information, there's nothing about money. Nowhere do we have anything about money. We have a lot about payments. We have a lot about this thing called digital cash or electronic cash, but it's never decided what that cash will be. In fact, when people are talking about it at the time, it seems implicit that it will be dollars or something like a national currency that'll simply be represented by an electronic token that goes around the internet, something that we might think of today as a stable coin. But if you look at the white paper itself, it doesn't talk anything about money or monetary system. It's a complete technological document that has an ideological layer of privacy on top of it. Now in January 3rd, 2009, we see the first proof of work function solved to start the Bitcoin blockchain. And embedded in that Genesis block, as some of you probably know, was the following text from the Financial Times in January 3rd, 2009, which was referencing the financial crisis of that just had occurred in the end of 2008. And this was the ideological push to put Bitcoin into the public. It was the banks had failed. We couldn't trust the financial sector, and we certainly couldn't trust the governments to get us out of it. Bitcoin, here we go. So again, an ideological, and in this case, maybe a political motivation. But if we look at sort of like the monetary policy here, Satoshi writes this right after Bitcoin is released. And it says total circulation will be 21 million coins. It'll be distributed to the network nodes when they make blocks, with the amount cut in half every 4 years. The first 4 years, basically 50 coins per block, divided by 2 every 4 years. When that runs out, the system can be supported on transaction fees. That's a really crappy monetary policy. If you're a central banker, or if you're somebody that's designing a monetary system, it seems pretty arbitrary. There's no real reason. Nobody knows why 21 million was chosen and why the time was chosen to be every 4 years to be halved. Nobody knows why it was, exactly 10 minutes in between blocks. All these things were sort of arbitrary at the time. So were Bitcoins ever meant to be money? If we look at when people are talking about, the people involved with the project were talking about what Bitcoin might be, well, Hal Finney, the one who received the first Bitcoin transaction in 2009, writes, it occurs to me that digital cash could be a collector's item. So it would get its value from scarcity the same way that an old comic book might. Nick Szabo, who did BitGold, says BitGold acts more like a collector's item than like gold. So again, they're not talking about money. They're talking about these things being collector's pieces, like trading cards. And Satoshi himself writes in 2010, before he goes dark, Bitcoins have no dividend or potential future dividend, therefore not like a stock, more like a collectible or a commodity. So again, nobody's thinking about it like money. They're thinking about it, even the ones creating it are thinking about it as something like a commodity or a collectible. In fact, collectible seems to be the more prominent definition. So if it's not money, what is Bitcoin or blockchains more generically? And I proposed in a paper that appears in the journal Theory, Culture, and Society that we can utilize this ontological turn in science and technology studies to understand them as assemblages of humans and non-humans, and to understand their definitions of how they are enacted. How are they put together and performed? What do people do with them? What are they? And so we can look at it as three ways that I propose. One is that they are systems of accounting. And if we take the notion that double entry bookkeeping was a catalyst for the modern free market capitalism, then this is perhaps triple entry bookkeeping, as some have described it, and perhaps then triple entry bookkeeping can propel us into yet a new era of economic system. And what can we put on a system of accounting like this? We could put debt obligations, titles to real property, titles to cars, financial assets, securities, patents, copyrights, etc. So all of these things can then be part of this new system of triple entry bookkeeping. So systems of accounting is one way to enact blockchains. The second is that they can be enacted as organizations, as organizational forms. And we can look at this from one of two perspectives. If we look at it from the Williamson transaction cost perspective, he asked, why do we have firms in the first place instead of this pairwise contracts between all sorts of individual contractors instead of having firms? And he argued it's because we have bounded rationality, opportunity costs, and there exists opportunists who will take advantage of those realities. So it's better to just subsume relations of production into a firm and rule by decree. However, if we use something like smart contracts to make up a firm instead of these hard to enforce social contracts, then we can decompose firms into these pairwise smart contracts without the transaction cost issue, because we will have full information, we have full ability to calculate, and given the things like proof of work, we don't have to worry about opportunists, because the whole point of the system is that everyone is an opportunist. We can also look at blockchains as organizational forms from Art Stinchcombe's perspective, that firms are simply a nexus of contracts. And here we can see things like decentralized autonomous organizations, DAOs, that have been built up from the ground up, let's say, as a series of smart contracts. Of course, DAOs have fallen out of favor because of various hacks and misuses of them, but the idea still stands that they could be an organizational form. And finally, blockchains could be enacted as institutions in their own right, institutions in the sociological sense, in that they both allow or restrict certain types of human behavior and interactions. Douglas North, from the institutional economics perspective, writes that how have economies in the past developed these institutions? That they provide credible commitments to create complex contracting. That's why we need institutions. But if we can take these all away from these institutions and put them into things like smart contracts that are decentralized and perfectly validated through proof of work, then we don't need that. And so by radically disintermediating quote unquote trusted third parties, which are often paradigmatic institutions themselves, such as central banks, payment systems, stock exchanges, etc., then they become, or they replace, the social institutions with these technologically based institutions. Vitalik Buterin, who was the co-creator of Ethereum and remains very active in it, early on wrote that blockchains are not about bringing to the world any one particular rule set. They're about creating the freedom to create new mechanism with a new rule set extremely quickly and pushing it out. They're the Lego mindstorms for building economic and social institutions. So this was recognized also by people involved in creating these, which is interesting because then we can see like a market for institutions. We could see which ones people like, which ones people adhere to, which ones they don't. And we've even seen that people have speculated that blockchains could be part of like a social order or a techno-leviathan in the Hobbesian sense, that instead of sacrificing our individual freedoms to the state, we sacrifice in order to get protection and social order, we now sacrifice them to the blockchain, as it were. And Brett Scott wrote about this at length in a 2015 essay. And I'll just read the quote because it's really fascinating. Don't decentralized blockchains offer the ultimate prospect of protected property rights with clear rules, but without the political interference? This is essentially the vision of the internet techno-leviathan, a deified crypto sovereign whose rules we can contract to. The rules being contracted to are a series of algorithms, step-by-step procedures for calculations, which can overridden with great difficulty. And in fact, we do see some blockchains that have been built with this sort of architecture in mind. If we look at EOS, it comes with a constitution. And the constitution, people adopt. If you are a user or a miner in the EOS blockchain, then you must contract to the constitution of the system. And in fact, every transaction that is effected on the system is also signed to the constitution digitally. So you can see here we have like Article 1, Article 2, and it's actually looks like a state constitution. So let's go back to my original question then. When is and where is Bitcoin money? So Bitcoin can be enacted, or other cryptocurrencies can be enacted ontologically as an institution of money. They can be used as money, but I argue that it will still only work or only have that effect of money when we have it as a socially recognized and exclusive unit of account. So where do we have that? So within the Bitcoin blockchain, that's kind of boring. It's like a one commodity economy that we like learn about in Econ 101 textbooks. Like you make Bitcoins and then you just send them around, and the miners do work and they get paid in Bitcoins, and then they can send them around, and people that want to transact send fees, and those are priced in Bitcoins and send them around. So it's not a very interesting economy. But we can look to Ethereum as perhaps a better example of a crypto economy where everything is priced in Ether. So here is, for example, a smart contract layer called CryptoKitties that some of you might be aware of. And CryptoKitties are smart contracts. Each kitty is unique, has unique attributes, and it has a price, a market price. And these market prices are priced in Ether. In order to use a CryptoKitty, if you transact, then you need to pay the mining network of the Ethereum network, and that's priced, the gas is priced in Ether. You can also do cool things like sire a kitty and mate them to create novel new CryptoKitties that have unique attributes. Siring comes with a fee. If you want to sire your CryptoKitty, you can charge money for it, but that money will be Ether. So here we have an economy, and it's not only CryptoKitties. You have all kinds of smart contracts, all kinds of NFTs, all kinds of ICOs and other ERC tokens that have been developed, and many of them through smart contracts that all use Ether as the unit of account. And so there's an economy here. There's an economy of production. You're making kitties, there's services, you're siring kitties, but all sorts of other stuff as well. If we look at that network, or that economy sort of as this network schematic, we could see how something like a CryptoKitty, but any sort of smart contract layer works here. And everything is priced in Ether. So we have gas available, gas, more gas, more gas, more gas, refunds, gas supply, all of this is priced in Ether. So here we have an economy where everything is priced in Ether. Now, it's not an economy like building tables and growing corn, like we would say, like in the real world, but it's an economy nonetheless. And we can see that there's different blockchains out there that are doing different things. So one blockchain might be better at doing, that CryptoKitty kind of stuff. Another one might be better at file storage, like storage or something. And now you can do atomic swaps. And so if you think of each of these blockchains as self-contained economies with their own currency, where their own native token is that money inside of that system, then you can have international exchange. So you can exchange now things with atomic swaps across blockchains, and this can be construed as international trade if we think about it. And so we need to settle accounts, and then there'll need to be conversions of one crypto token for another. The same way that we would use, if we go abroad and travel, we need to convert dollars to pounds and vice versa. But there's also going to be an entire foreign exchange and a whole Forex market around this. And so we can see that there's now this possibility of a global, quote unquote, cyber crypto economy, but it's completely different from the economy we have here. So it's not that we have these global world monies, but we have these self-contained money worlds, just the same way that we have self-contained nation states, each with their own economies and their own monies. So now we have Bitcoin, and that might serve as this like gold base layer, whatever we want to call it. We have Ethereum, we have Ripple, EOS, yada, 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 and a million others now. And maybe the exchange rates between those will stop fluctuating against the dollar, for example, as the point of reference, and start becoming a function of the internal economic activity that's going on in each of these places and how valuable they are in relative terms. So with that, I will end it and open it up for discussion and questions and answers. And I hope that you found it interesting. So I'll keep the screen up like this. Alex, you're muted.
I was just saying, thank you very much, Adam. That was very interesting. As usual, we open the floor to questions from the audience. And please bear in mind that you have two ways of asking questions. One would be to raise your hand here in my panelists window, and the other one would be to formulate your questions in the Q&A box, which is here. So please don't hesitate, and let me break the ice just by asking the following. That was very interesting. So here we have an argument against some corners of social science academia who have seen Bitcoin exclusively in terms of, is it money, is it not money, does it fit our definition, and so on and so forth. We have this tradition of sociology of money, and we've heard an argument against it. So let me break the ice. As I said, I wanted to ask you, Adam, about two elements. So you mentioned we can see Bitcoin as a unit of account or systems of accounting, not unit of account. Blockchains as systems of accounting, as organizational forms, and as institutions. But you haven't reflected at all about action, because ultimately, we need to think about, well, what kind of action unfolds within these organizational forms, and how is it constrained or enabled by these institutions? Is it similar, dissimilar with other types of social actions we see in what we would call, well, the real world, in the physical world, not in the digital world? Or is it different? So where's the concept of action here, and how does it fit with your organizations, institutions, and systems of accounting? And the other thing, well, ultimately, these blockchains are on the ground. We have mines, we have server farms, we have a lot of activity on the ground, and ultimately, it's, a social materiality out there, not just ideas, debates, discourses, and so on. Where does that play a role in your picture, in your narrative?
Yeah, so I think the confounding thing that keeps coming up again and bothering people about, like, why hasn't Bitcoin or other cryptos taken off? And why isn't it being used is because I think its best use case is indeed virtual. It's not human, right? The real world, as we say, we already have social institutions and we have good working monetary systems. I mean, we might not trust the government to a certain degree, but at the end of the day, these social institutions have been developed over the course of human history to solve various functions, and they work. And we don't necessarily need to, unless we're like a cypherpunk or somebody who's completely libertarian, that they believe the government should have no role whatsoever. Most of us don't mind using a credit card, or most of us don't mind that we're using dollars or euros or pounds. Most of us don't mind that we're using the internet that, you know, through an internet service provider. So the fact is that I don't think they're so applicable for the quote unquote real world. Where I do see them, and this will also fit in with sort of your question about the mundane materiality of this all, is that it could be more useful, for example, with the Internet of Things, or with the network devices that we're going to start seeing more and more, such as driverless cars, smart devices, but even like little sensors in smart cities that would be mainly hidden from us in the built environment. So I think that these things would be doing things like micro auctions, for example, things that social norms would normally take care of, but that computers are very bad at because they don't have social norms. So for example, if you're getting onto the highway and you're merging into ongoing traffic, there are social norms about how you enter the road, or who should speed up, who should slow down. We kind of understand if we don't want to have an accident, one of us has got to give. And there's norms about that. Same with norms of riding a bicycle, you know, in traffic, etc. If you're a machine like a driverless car, that's not going to work. So instead, you might use an economic solution like an auction. And these would be micro auctions, something, you know, like I bid a fraction of a cent more than you to get in the traffic first. Well, human beings can't deal with fractions of a cent. Like social norms are much easier than having to do a micro auction. But for systems like this, micro auctions could be done all the time in real time with these transactions going back and forth. In this sort of secure, decentralized, automated manner. And in that respect, I see that's where it comes back to the real world, that I don't think it'll simply be virtual in the sense of like bots buying and selling advertising time on, you know, a digital advertisement space, or buying and selling stocks, or buying and selling server time. I think that will be part of it, but it will also be this Internet of Things as well.
Thank you very much. So I see that my colleague Crawford has raised his hand. So Crawford, over to you. Crawford?
Can you hear me?
Yes, now we can.
Yeah, this is weird, this webinar thing. You can't see any other participants. Anyway, fine, cool. Hi, Adam. Good to see you. And thanks for the longue durée perspective on Bitcoin. Most people start off with a white paper, and you went way beyond that, which was really useful, actually, because you don't normally see such an in-depth kind of genealogy. My question is really to do with the political dimensions. I mean, I suppose one way of understanding what Bitcoin is to look at the political ideologies surrounding it. And you've touched on this as you've gone through, but I wonder if you could say something a little bit more concrete about it. I mean, one of the reasons I find Bitcoin and digital currencies interesting is also because I have a suspicion of government and big corporations. However, I've never gone to a Bitcoin event or listened to a Bitcoin proselytizer and come away thinking, I hope these guys win. You know, I'm always deeply unsettled by almost everything they talk about. So, you know, is there anything socially progressive going on here? Or, I mean, presumably it's, you know, maybe there are progressive elements or reactionary libertarian elements. I mean, can you say something a bit more about the political dimension here?
So I must admit that I have not been to a crypto conference probably for 4 or 5 years now. So I don't know what the new developments are, although I can imagine that they're all concerning. But I can speak to the fact that the cypherpunks were mainly ideologically libertarian or politically libertarian, and they were very much connected, especially people like Nick Szabo has written essays on Austrian theory of money and Austrian economics, and they're very interested in what Hayek had to say, for example, and very interested in that line of thought. They're very anti-Keynesian because they see that Keynesian economics is very much linked with central government power and central banks using monetary tools and things like that. But there's problems with the way Bitcoin was developed. If you think that this is supposed to be the hard money of the libertarian dream, it fails the regression theorem, first of all, which is that, you know, if gold is money, it was only useful as money because it was at some point back at time zero used for something else, like jewelry or something like that, or statue making. So it was socially valuable for some reason and then became economically valuable as the next step. If we go back to the beginning of Bitcoin, there is no Bitcoin jewelry or Bitcoin statues equivalent. So the regression theory fails. The other thing, though, is that what you see from a lot of the projects that have come up, Bitcoin aside, but a lot of them look like they're get-rich-fast schemes, or they're ways to implement capitalism on something like a blockchain, which is not what I think the initial spirit of the cypherpunks was at all. And in some respect, I think that's actually interesting. So one thing I told when Alex and I were talking before I settled on this talk, one of the sort of cool things that I think that you could see happening is looking at Bitcoin mining. So initially you have individuals producing on their computers. This is like primitive commodity production, one CPU, one hash. This was Satoshi's vision. Then you have this sort of technological advancement into GPUs or graphic processors. And at that point, it became more economical to pool resources into mining pools. So here we sort of see like collaborative, cooperative production. Then we have development of ASIC mining chips, which then accelerates these things so much that those are no longer viable. And you need to do these large server farms of mining farms, which is now transitioning into capitalism. And now we have a crisis where you have mining farms going out of business because the price of Bitcoin is fluctuating so much that their cost of production is higher than the market price. So it's really interesting that you see this sort of like Marxist version of historical materialism manifest here, which is completely not what anyone in the Bitcoin community would say this is what's going on. They are adherent to Austrian economics, certainly not Marxist economics. So there is something interesting to be said about this politics that it's very much a patchwork in reality, and it's also very much contradictory to like the statements that people make about like, oh, hard money and this and that, and yet that's not at all what it's used as. I hope that answered your question. I think I just went off on a tangent instead.
No, that's helpful. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Adam. That was a thought-provoking presentation. So we need to ruminate more upon the consequences and how we approach the entire blockchain phenomenon when we are talking about organizational forms and institutions here. This being said, a warm thank you. As it just happens, I have in a few minutes a research interview on blockchain scheduled. So it's just how it is. So this being said, warmest thanks to Adam and a round of applause. Warmest thanks to our audience here. We are reconvening next Wednesday with a roundtable on whatever happened to FTX, and those in the audience familiar with horror films, Joan Crawford and Betty Davis will know what I'm talking about. We have 3 panelists next Wednesday, namely Gail Rogers from the University of Pittsburgh, Ian Taylor, the CEO of Crypto UK, and Ludovic van Zetten, who will cover the legal aspects of this horror production. So I look forward to seeing you all next week, same time, same place. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Bye.
Thank you.